Hey guys, today I'll be showing you the step-by-step process involved with making a Silnylon tarp. And though I'll be showing you how I made my ground tarp, ultimately this can apply to any type of tarp you want to make, like a hammock tarp or even a tarp tent. A lot of the building blocks are the same, and this will probably help you in any of your adventures building shelter. So anyways, what I decided to make was a Silnylon ground tarp because I won't be able to use my hammock along the PCT, so what I wanted was some type of lightweight tent to use when I'm on the ground. The tarp is 9.5 feet long along the ridge line. At the foot end it is 6 feet wide, and at the head end it is 8 feet wide. Each of the edges has a pretty shallow cat cut in it to help the tarp pitch tighter. And it's pitched with trekking poles, and there are 6 guy lines that help secure the tarp and make it pitch really tight. So let's go ahead and get started. One thing I guess I should mention before we start, the headroom on this tarp is adjustable, so it's not like a tent where you have a set headroom of 40 inches. I designed it to have 42 inches of headroom, so that's plenty of room to sit up and cook and stuff like that. But you can pitch it higher, you can pitch it lower. Obviously, you would pitch higher on a warm day when you want a cooler breeze. You would pitch low with windy conditions or really heavy rain just to keep the rain out. But it's variable, and also it's pretty versatile. It can be pitched in quite a few different formations depending on what you need. But that's enough about tarps. Let's go ahead and get into how to build one. As you can see in the first picture here, this is just the raw Silnylon. I ordered it from Ripstop by the roll, and I ordered 9 yards because I have several projects in mind, but if you were to replicate this, you really only need 7 yards. And because the ridgeline is 9'6", what I did was cut that long piece of Silnylon into 2 squares just a little bit longer than 9.5 feet. And the reason I did that was just in case I made any mistakes. So just think maybe 9 foot 8 inches, 9 foot 10 inches, just to give yourself a little room to work. And so what I did, I made those 2 squares, and I haven't cut anything on the width, so this is the natural width of the Silnylon. I think it's around 60 inches. And what I'm going to be doing now is joining these 2 squares. If you can't tell, this is one square of Silnylon sitting on top of the other. I'm going to be joining them along one of the long edges using a flat felled seam. And if you don't know what that is, you might want to Google it. It's basically a triple stitch seam. So you sew one stitch to join the 2 pieces of fabric, then you flip them inside out, sew another stitch parallel to that first stitch, and then you'll have a French seam, and from there you secure the little flap of the French seam back down to the tarp with a 3rd stitch. And the reasoning behind a flat felled seam is primarily for strength. It adds a lot of strength to the ridgeline of the tarp. And secondarily, it actually is a little more water resistant than any other type of seam you might use. One thing to keep in mind, you want to make sure that you have the right side of the fabric facing each other. So when you're in a Silnylon tarp, you want the shiny side of the fabric, which is the calendared side, facing towards you, towards the inside of the tent or the tarp, and you want the dull side, the flat side, to face out towards the rain. So when you're aligning these 2 squares of Silnylon, make sure that you have the appropriate sides touching each other. In this case, you want the shiny sides facing each other and the dull sides facing out. So here you can see in this next picture, this is the initial seam that's joining these 2 rectangles. And I guess I didn't mention, I like to join the tarp. I'd like to do the flat felled seam along the ridgeline first, and then I just kind of fold it in half, and then I mark out the sides of the tarp. And that seems a little counterintuitive, but I've actually found it works out better just because it's a lot easier to get this flat felled seam out of the way first and then measure from there. So this is the first stitch, as I said, just joining the 2 pieces, and it's about a 1/4 inch wide stitch. This is actually the second stitch, and what this is creating here is a French seam. On the far right is where the first stitch is, and those two sheets of Silnylon are folded apart in the opposite direction, and then another stitch is done parallel to the first stitch. It's a little hard to describe this, but if you look up what a French seam is and what a flat-felled seam is, you'll understand a little better. So this is after the second stitch here, and this is what a French seam looks like. This is another view. It basically creates a little flap here between the two stitches, and what the flat-felled seam does is join this flap back down onto the tarp to make a triple stitched ridgeline. And here's the beginning of the flat-felled seam, and you can see where the flap is being sewn down onto the tarp. Okay, after the flat-felled seam is done, what I do next is fold the single piece of Silnylon now that's been joined in the middle. I fold it in half along that ridge line and secure it back to the ground nice and taut so I can actually start marking out the sides of the tarp. In these next couple of pictures, you can see how I'm laying out the cat cuts for the side of the tarp. And if you don't know, cat cuts are basically arcs in the sides of the tarp that allow it to pitch tighter. If you think of the two sides of this arc being pulled out by stakes, the center of the arc is going to want to pull down, and it'll actually pull out the inner fabric of the tarp and create a tighter pitch all around. Now what I'm doing aren't true cat cuts, but I'm not really going to go into too many details on cat cuts. You can look those up online and get some better information. But the way I lay them out is with cardboard and a length of rope, and I calculate that according to how long the arc should be, and there's several factors that go into it. These aren't really true cat curves, but they do serve the function to pitch the tarp tighter, and I've actually found that these work just as well as the larger cat cuts that I did on my hammock tarp. And you can see here I lay out the curve on the cardboard, outline it with a Sharpie, and then just cut it out with a knife. These aren't that precise, but honestly, given the margin of error that I have, and probably most people have when they're sewing, it's not really going to make a huge difference. And I know there will be people that are great at sewing that will argue with that, but in general, these tend to work pretty well. So after I have the cat cut curves laid out on the cardboard, then I move on to the actual Silnylon and I start marking out the sides of the tarp. Now, if you picture the tarp as a single side of the tarp, there are three curves. There's the head curve at the head of the tarp, there's the entire length tarp, the edge of the tarp, and then there's the foot width of the tarp that also has a cat curve. So there are three cat curves that you need to calculate and draw out onto the tarp. So you can see here I am laying out the head curve, the cat curve on the head of the tarp, and I've got it weighted down, I've got it marked out to the appropriate dimensions, and then I draw onto the tarp and I'm cutting it out here, and you can see the curve, it's not actually completely perpendicular to the ridge line of the tarp. I actually brought that corner in about a foot to have a little bit of an overhang. And again, I did that A, to add a little protection from rain, and B, to help the tarp pitch tighter. So this is the initial head curve being cut out. Here you can see I have the long end, or the long edge of the tarp. I have the cat curve laid out with that really long piece of cardboard here, and I've got it weighted out with whatever I can find. And here I am cutting that curve. And I actually didn't show the tail curve, but it's the same idea as the head and as the long edge. You just line it up, trace it, and then cut out the curve. A lot of the design of this tarp, or a lot of the work of this tarp, is in the design, so this layout part should move fairly fast. Now after I have all of the sides of the tarp cut out, there's really not a lot of work remaining on the tarp. The first thing you need to do, as you can see here, are reinforce the corner tieouts on the tarp. And on this tarp there are the 2 ridgeline tieouts and the 4 corner tieouts. So there will be 6 tieouts that you need to reinforce. As you can see here, I did that by cutting a circle of fabric and then folding it in half. You want to make sure the 2 edges of this reinforcement are going to be in a rolled hem, so those won't unravel, but you want to make sure that the top edge, facing the top of the screen there, you want to make sure that it's not just a normal cut edge. You want to secure it in some way. I did that by folding it in half. You could also do that by putting just a little simple rolled hem there, just to make sure that the material doesn't unravel on you. So what I did was sew just 3 horizontal stitches onto the little patch there, and that's plenty to reinforce the edge of the tarp. And really, I'm not entirely sure that reinforcements are actually necessary. The Silnylon is pretty strong on its own, but these add they add a nice look to the tarp, and it's kind of just how things are done. So here's the reinforcement stitched on. I then trimmed the excess fabric from the edge of the reinforcement, and I did this to each of the 6 corners of the tarp. You can see here are the circles I cut out to form the actual reinforcement, and I just used a lid from a jar. Here is the actual ridgeline reinforcement. I could not use the circle because it wasn't quite big enough, so what I did was cut a square, fold it in half to form a triangle, and just sew that onto the ridgeline there. After you're done with the reinforcements, the biggest thing that remains is just doing a rolled hem along the edge of the entire tarp, which sounds like a big task, but it actually goes fairly quick. All you're doing is folding the fabric edge over once and then over once again and securing it with a row of stitching, and you just do that around the perimeter of the entire tarp. After you're done with the rolled hem, you move on to tying on the guideline points, or the tie-out points. On my ridgeline I use D-rings just because there's typically the ridgeline of the tarp has a lot more stress on it than the normal tie-out points, so I like to do that a little stronger. I use nylon webbing and D-rings just to distribute the force a little more evenly along the webbing. And I attach the webbing on the top side and the underside of the ridgeline reinforcement area, and I just do a zigzag stitch or a bar tack 2 times over the webbing just to secure it in place. And that should be plenty to hold it there. And you can actually see between the edge of the tarp and the D-ring, I've done a tiny little single row of stitching just to keep the D-ring where it needs to be in its little place there. And so I do this to both sides of the ridgeline, and then I do lighter weight reinforcements along the tie-out points, the 4 guy lines. And you can see here's the other side. And here's what a lighter reinforcement looks like. For this I just used grosgrain ribbon, and as you can see I bar tacked it onto the corner of the reinforcement. And I actually didn't do this one on top, one side on top and one side on bottom as I did with the nylon webbing. For this I just did both sides on the bottom, bar tacked it, and I was done with it. You can also see here how the rolled hem along the edge of the tarp joins at the corners. They just kind of fold over onto each other. And then what I did, this is just something I like to do with all of my tarps, is put a ring of bungee cord or elastic, and this is a fairly thick, I think that's 1/8 inch thick bungee, and I make a little ring, and that just keeps the tarp tight. You'll notice sometimes when it gets cold or when the tarp gets wet that the Silnylon will stretch, and this little bungee allows a little more give room so the tarp stays pitched tight under all conditions. So I really like to use those. Here you can see the little midway guy point that I put in but on the long edge of both sides of the tarp, and this will help to pitch tighter in windy conditions and rainy conditions. I didn't reinforce it because there shouldn't really be a lot of stress on this, at least not enough to tear it. And this is just grosgrain ribbon stuck under the edge of the tarp and bar tacked on. One thing you want to make sure you do when you're attaching the ribbon is to treat the edge of the ribbon with a flame and just seal it up so it doesn't unravel on you. And you can see the underside here, just tacked right onto that rolled hem. Now, because I intend on later adding a mosquito net with a bathtub floor, I added these little grosgrain tie-outs onto the nylon webbing, and I put a little circular plastic ring on them. And what I intend to do with these is to actually clip the top of the bug net into these rings. I have one on each side of the tarp, and that should hold a tension into the bug net and allow it to form a little small tent under the tarp to protect me from mosquitoes and so on. And that's what that looks like. I just used a couple single rows of stitching back and forth to secure the webbing. Now this is actually the interior of the tarp ridgeline, and throughout the interior at about 4 locations I added some little tie-outs, and these could be used in the future for holding up a mosquito netting or just tying my headlamp to them, adding some storage onto the tarp ridgeline. Not necessary, but I always like to add stuff like that just in case I need it. And that is it. That is all it takes to build a tarp. You can see here's the finished outstretched tarp, and the long seam in the middle is your flat felled seam. Along all the edges are rolled hems, and you can see the reinforcement and the tie-outs on each of the corners. And this is what it looks like pitched. This is a view right down the middle. It's pitched really tight. This is actually after I seam sealed it. One thing you will need to do is seam seal the tarp, and I have a video on that coming out pretty soon if you need information on that. And you can actually see in this other picture here all of the little tie-outs that I put on the inside of the ridgeline. Alright, well I hope that helped you. If you have any question, just leave them in the comments and I'll try to get to them. This was just kind of a broad overview. I could go into more details. If anyone wants the actual dimensions or anything like that, just let me know. And I also have a Google SketchUp. What I did was design this tarp in Google SketchUp first, so if anyone is into Google SketchUp and wants the files of this tarp, I can send those as well. Alright, well I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned. We've got some more stuff soon. See you later.